He never thought the boy he raised would one day treat him like garbage and stand silent while his wife cut the last thread of his dignity. The words fell like a blade across the dinner table, cold and final. He was nothing but an extra mouth to feed. His heart pounded as betrayal settled into his bones, the kind that makes silence louder than any scream. Yet behind the humiliation, something stirred. A secret they never saw coming. A weapon hidden in plain sight. What happened next would turn their world upside down. Before we continue, subscribe and share where you're watching from. Thomas had spent 60 years carving out a life built on the rhythms of hard work, quiet sacrifice, and the small comforts that come from knowing who you are in the world. He wasn't a man of extravagance, never the sort to chase after things that glittered but meant nothing. His late wife, Eleanor, had been the light of his days, the anchor of every storm, and when the cancer took her, it left him gutted like a house stripped of its foundation. He moved through the days afterward in a fog, the rooms echoing with a silence that pressed down on him heavier than any weight he had carried in his working years. There were mornings when he brewed coffee for two out of sheer muscle memory, only to stare at the empty chair across the table until the cup in his hand went cold. But through that grief, he held on to one belief with all the force he had left. He still had Daniel, his only son, his blood, his reason to keep moving. Losing Eleanor hadn't destroyed him completely because he told himself that Daniel would be there, a piece of family still breathing, still close enough to remind him that he wasn't truly alone. Daniel was 32, a man with a sharp suit and quicker ambitions. Someone Thomas didn't always understand, but always supported. Thomas had worked with his hands, sweating under the Texas sun, building a modest home and a life that revolved around duty more than dreams. Daniel, though, had taken a different path, one that gleamed with promises. Thomas couldn't quite grasp, but admired nonetheless. When Eleanor's funeral ended and the neighbors drifted away, Thomas noticed the way Daniel kept his phone in his hand more than he kept his eyes on his father. But he pushed the thought aside. Everyone grieves differently, he told himself. Daniel would come around. He had to. The nights were the worst. Thomas would sit on the porch swing Eleanor had loved, staring into the black Texas sky, dotted with stars she used to name aloud, like old friends. He'd hear the distant hum of cars on the highway, the chirp of crickets, the hollow creak of the swing's chains, and he would think about how much of his life had been poured into his family. Every paycheck, every sacrifice, every late night was for them. When Eleanor died, he thought the ledger was still balanced because he had Daniel. Blood doesn't turn its back. Sons don't forget the hands that built their childhood. But the house was a battlefield of memories he couldn't win against. The smell of Eleanor's perfume still clung to the closet. The dishes she favored still stacked in the cabinet. The quilt she had stitched still folded neatly at the end of their bed. Thomas couldn't walk the hallway without feeling her absence pressing in on him like a shadow that never moved. So he made the choice. He sold the home they had built from the ground up, the home that had held every birthday, every Christmas, every whispered promise across the dinner table. It broke him to let it go, but he told himself it was necessary. He couldn't breathe inside walls that reminded him of everything he had lost. Daniel and his wife, Melissa, offered him a room for a while. At least that's how Daniel phrased it, with a casual tone, as though it was the obvious solution. Melissa didn't say much, her polite smile never reaching her eyes. But Thomas was too worn down to notice the ice behind it. He told himself it was a blessing. He wouldn't be alone. He'd be close to Daniel. He could still be part of something bigger than his grief. At first, he tried to stay invisible. He tucked himself into the small guest room at the back of their townhouse, unpacked his 2 suitcases, and kept everything tidy. He cooked when he could, cleaned the kitchen, offered to run errands. He tried to make himself useful, not wanting to be a burden, always careful not to leave his coffee mug in the sink or his shoes by the door. Melissa barely looked at him, her eyes flicking past him like he was part of the furniture. And Daniel, distracted by work, rarely noticed the tension settling over the house like dust. Thomas told himself it didn't matter. They were busy. Young people have their own lives, but grief has a way of sharpening the smallest slights. He noticed the sigh Melissa let slip when he asked a question during a TV show. He noticed the way she changed the channel while he was watching, not even glancing his way as if his opinion carried no weight. One evening, as he passed her in the hall, he swore he heard her mutter under her breath, "Freeloader." The word lodged in his chest like a splinter. He wanted to believe he had misheard, but deep down he knew he hadn't. Daniel didn't defend him. When Thomas mentioned the coldness he felt, Daniel brushed it off. "She's stressed," he said. "Work's been hard on her." Thomas nodded, swallowing the shame that rose in his throat. He told himself to endure. That's what fathers do. They take the hits, they stay quiet, they don't rock the boat. Yet each day, the silence grew heavier. Thomas found himself lingering in the guest room longer, avoiding the kitchen, making his meals quick and quiet. At night, he would lie awake on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, thinking of Eleanor and wondering if this was what life had shrunk to, existing like a shadow in the home of his only son. Still, he clung to the fragile hope that things would turn, that Daniel would look at him one day and see not a burden, but the father who had given everything. He convinced himself that time would soften Melissa, that grief had made everyone raw, and that eventually they would remember the bond that once made them a family. But deep inside, a quiet unease began to stir. It was the same feeling he had when storm clouds built over the plains, when the air went still and the sky darkened in a way that promised something fierce was coming. Thomas could sense it in the clipped words, the averted eyes, the empty politeness that barely covered contempt. He knew in his bones that something was shifting, and it wasn't in his favor. The nights on the porch swing felt different now. He no longer looked at the stars with Eleanor's names in his head. He looked at the dark stretch of road leading away from Daniel's house and wondered how long it would be before he was forced onto it with nothing more than those same 2 suitcases at his feet. The thought chilled him, but he pushed it aside, telling himself he was imagining it, telling himself his son would never let it happen. Yet the silence between them stretched, and the small cracks of indifference widened. And then, one evening, as the table grew tense and the air thick with unspoken words, Thomas would finally hear the sentence that shattered the last piece of fragile hope he had been clinging to. What came out of Melissa's mouth would slice deeper than any insult, and Daniel's silence would wound more than any shouted betrayal. But that moment had not yet arrived. For now, Thomas sat quietly, waiting, unaware that the storm he sensed was already on its way, ready to break his world apart in ways he could never forget. Thomas stood on the edge of the driveway one last time, staring at the house in Cedar Ridge that had been more than wood and brick. It was a history book written in creaking floorboards, in the faded paint on the porch swing Eleanor loved, in the kitchen tiles worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Every corner whispered her name. He could almost hear her laugh spilling from the upstairs window, the one that caught the morning sun just right, or feel the warmth of her hand brushing past him as she set dinner on the table. But those echoes were knives now, cutting deeper with each day he tried to stay inside the life they had built together. So he let it go. The papers were signed, the keys handed over, and Thomas walked away with 2 suitcases, a heart still raw, and a silence that felt heavier than anything he had carried in all his years. Daniel said it would only be temporary, a room in his townhouse until Thomas figured out what came next. Melissa, standing just behind him, gave a polite nod, her smile tight as a pulled thread. She didn't hug Thomas. She didn't even reach for his hand. It was as if his presence was a favor she had agreed to for Daniel's sake, nothing more. Thomas noticed, but said nothing. He told himself it didn't matter. What mattered was that he would not be alone. What mattered was that Daniel, his only son, still had a place for him. The townhouse was neat, sterile, not a trace of warmth in its sharp-edged furniture and spotless white walls. No photographs of family, no clutter that spoke of life lived, just a carefully curated space that felt more like a rental showroom than a home. Thomas carried his suitcases down the narrow hall to the guest room in the back. The mattress was stiff, the sheets smelled faintly of bleach, and the single lamp cast a pale light that seemed to flatten everything in the room. He unpacked slowly, stacking shirts with deliberate care, arranging his shaving kit in the bathroom, trying to make the space his own. But it never felt like his. It was a room meant for passing through, not for living. Melissa barely looked at him. When he came into the kitchen, she would brush past, her eyes already on something else, her lips pressed into silence. At dinner, she sat across the table, scrolling through her phone, answering Daniel with curt nods, never once asking Thomas about his day. She carried herself with the air of someone tolerating a guest who had overstayed his welcome before he even arrived. Daniel didn't notice, or pretended not to. He spoke to his father in clipped sentences, the kind of small talk that skimmed the surface of everything and never dared to dive deeper. Thomas tried to make himself useful. He swept the porch, folded laundry, cooked dinners when Melissa worked late. He thought of it as a way to repay their kindness, to show he wasn't there just to take up space. But the more he tried, the less they seemed to see him. Melissa once changed the channel on the television mid-program while Thomas was watching, not even glancing at him as she flipped to a reality show he couldn't stand. When he asked a simple question about groceries, she rolled her eyes as if his words were an inconvenience. He told himself it was nothing. People grieve differently. People carry stress in ways that make them sharp around the edges. Daniel had his career, Melissa had her routines, and he was simply a new piece in a puzzle they hadn't expected to fit. Still, the weight of it pressed on him. He would sit in the guest room at night, staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of traffic outside, and feel the hollowness gnawing at him. The house in Cedar Ridge had been filled with laughter, with Eleanor humming as she washed dishes, with the smell of fresh cornbread baking on Sunday afternoons. This new place was filled with silence so tight it choked him. He thought about calling neighbors back in Cedar Ridge, but the thought of explaining why he left stopped him cold. To admit he had abandoned that house was to admit he had been defeated by memories. To admit he was living under Daniel's roof was to admit he was no longer strong enough to stand on his own. Pride is a cruel thing. It doesn't allow confession, even when confession might bring relief. And so Thomas swallowed the ache, day after day. He told himself this was only for a short time, that once the sting of loss eased, he would find a place of his own. But each morning when he made coffee and set the cup down at an empty table, the silence reminded him of the truth. He wasn't welcome here, not in the way a man longs to be. He was tolerated, not wanted. A shadow in the corner of his own son's home. Melissa's glances cut sharper with each week. Her footsteps in the hall carried irritation. Her sighs grew louder when Thomas lingered too long in the living room. Daniel remained blind, or perhaps willfully ignorant, always assuring his father that things were fine. But Thomas knew the way Melissa's eyes followed him, not with kindness, not even with indifference, but with resentment. It was the look of someone who wanted their space back, who wanted him gone. Still, Thomas clung to the fragile hope that Daniel's presence was enough, that as long as his son was near, he had not lost everything. At night, when he sat on the edge of the bed and the cold light from the street lamp spilled through the blinds, he whispered Eleanor's name, telling her he was trying, telling her he was holding on. The walls didn't answer, but the silence carried its own kind of truth, one he wasn't ready to face. The townhouse walls grew tighter, the distance between them greater. Melissa's silence wasn't silence anymore. It was contempt. Daniel's small talk wasn't small talk anymore. It was absence. And Thomas, sitting quietly with his folded shirts and careful chores, began to sense it in the air, the way a farmer senses a storm before the clouds gather. Something was coming, something that would strip away the last fragile thread of belonging he had left. He didn't know when, he didn't know how, but deep in his bones he felt it pressing closer, and when it arrived, it would change everything. Thomas had always believed that the cruelest wounds weren't the ones that came from raised voices or slammed doors, but the ones delivered quietly under the breath, with no witnesses but the person they were meant to cut. Living under Daniel's roof was proving that belief true in ways he had never imagined. Melissa moved through her own house with a practiced grace that somehow managed to leave Thomas feeling like an intruder in every room he entered. She rolled her eyes when he asked questions, the kind of small, ordinary questions a man asks when he's trying to make himself useful. "What time do you usually have dinner? Do you want me to pick up groceries? Should I fold the laundry this way or that?" Nothing intrusive, nothing demanding. Yet each time her eyes flicked upward and away, that single gesture told him what words never needed to. "You don't belong here." Sometimes it was worse than that. Passing him in the hallway, her lips barely moved, but he caught the mutter, sharp and unkind, as though the very air around him was wasting her energy. He couldn't always make out the words, but he didn't need to. He had heard enough in his life to know the tone of disdain, the rhythm of contempt. Once he was certain she whispered freeloader, the word clinging to him long after she disappeared into the next room. It wrapped around his chest and settled heavy, like a stone he couldn't put down. Daniel didn't see it, or maybe he chose not to. When Thomas tried to speak, mentioning the way Melissa seemed distant, cold, Daniel brushed it off with the ease of a man who didn't want to look too closely. "She's stressed," he said. "Work's been rough." He said it as though stress explained every flicker of Melissa's disdain, as though her cutting silences and sharp glances were nothing more than fatigue. Thomas nodded, swallowing his pride, and forced the words back down. That was easier. That was safer. The house itself began to feel hostile in small, invisible ways. Melissa would change the channel while he was watching, her finger pressing the remote as though his presence in the room didn't matter at all. If he paused to glance at the screen, she didn't look up, didn't apologize, didn't even acknowledge him. At dinner, she often spoke only to Daniel, leaving Thomas to sit in silence with the clink of silverware filling the void. Some nights, the conversation flowed around him as though he were a ghost, invisible and unnecessary. A hollow man seated at their table out of habit rather than welcome. It was humiliation wrapped in politeness, loneliness disguised as household routine. Thomas had always been a man of dignity, a man who worked with his hands, built homes and repaired fences, who had provided for his family without complaint. To be reduced now to a shadow in his own son's home, to be tolerated instead of respected, was a cut deeper than any insult could deliver. He found himself shrinking, moving quieter, leaving fewer traces of himself behind. He washed his dishes immediately, folded his blanket neatly, kept to his small back room as though retreating could make him less of a burden. But retreating didn't help. The contempt still seeped through the walls. Melissa's sighs when he lingered too long in the kitchen were louder than words. The way she shut the door behind her with just a little more force told him he was in the way. Each moment chipped at him until even breathing in her presence felt like a crime. He wondered sometimes if Eleanor would recognize him now, this man who crept around corners and silenced himself at the table, who endured insult with a bowed head instead of fire in his chest. She had married a man who stood tall, who carried weight without complaint. Would she even know him now, stripped down to this hushed version of himself? And yet, despite it all, Thomas clung to Daniel. He told himself that Daniel's silence wasn't betrayal. It was ignorance. He convinced himself that one day his son would look at him and see what was happening, that one day he would defend him, would tell Melissa that this man, his father, deserved respect. But each day that passed without Daniel noticing, without him speaking up, the hope thinned, fragile as glass stretched too far. Nights became his only refuge. He sat on the edge of his bed, the faint hum of traffic bleeding through the window, staring at the ceiling as though the cracks in the plaster might offer answers. He thought of Cedar Ridge, of the house filled with Eleanor's laughter, of the kitchen warm with her cooking, of the way she reached for his hand under the table when life was heavy. He thought of what he had lost and what he had traded it for. A small, cold room where even his breathing felt like an intrusion. The worst part wasn't Melissa's muttered insults. It wasn't even the rolling eyes, the dismissive glances, the suffocating sense of being unwelcome. The worst part was Daniel's silence. His son, the boy he had raised with rough hands and a tender heart, the man who should have been his last anchor in a storm, sat across from him at the table and said nothing. Each time Melissa cut him with her contempt, Daniel's silence was a second wound. A wound deeper, sharper, because it came from blood. Thomas began to feel it in his bones, the inevitability of something breaking. The tension in the house was a storm gathering in silence, thickening the air until each breath felt heavy. He knew the way skies looked before thunder split them open, the way the stillness of the plains could suddenly shift into chaos. He knew it the same way now. He could sense it in the clipped words, in the silence stretching longer each evening, in the way Melissa's eyes burned with unspoken truth. Something was coming, and when it came, it would shatter the fragile hope he had clung to since Eleanor died. For now he said nothing. He endured. He folded his shirts neatly, washed the dishes, stayed out of the way. But inside, the weight of humiliation pressed harder with each passing day, crushing the last remnants of his dignity. What he didn't know, what he couldn't yet see, was how close the moment of breaking truly was. The moment when Melissa's contempt would no longer hide behind mutters and glances, when the words would be spoken aloud, final and cruel, and Daniel's silence would decide everything. The night it all broke open began without warning, the kind of evening that should have passed in silence like the many before it. Thomas had spent the afternoon cooking, not because anyone asked him to, but because it gave him something to do, something that made him feel useful. He made chicken pot pie, Daniel's favorite since boyhood, the dish Eleanor used to serve on cold nights when the world outside their windows seemed cruel, but their home was warm. He thought maybe the smell of it would stir something in his son, maybe even a flicker of the bond that had once tied them together. By the time they sat down, the pie was steaming on the table, the crust golden, the filling rich and familiar. Melissa was scrolling through her phone, the glow lighting her face while her fork clinked idly against the plate. Daniel sipped his beer, his tie loosened, his eyes distant. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the scrape of utensils, the muted hum of the refrigerator. Thomas tried to fill it once, asking about Daniel's day, but his words fell flat. Daniel nodded without looking up. The air grew heavier, and Thomas could feel the edge of something sharp lingering beneath it. Then Melissa set her phone down and looked up with a smirk that chilled him. "You know," she said, her voice casual, but laced with poison, "maybe it's time we stop pretending this is temporary. We're not a charity. We can't keep feeding an extra mouth forever." The words landed like a blade across the table, slicing through Thomas's chest with surgical precision. His breath caught, his heart hammering against his ribs as though trying to escape. He looked at her, stunned, searching her face for some hint of a joke, some sign that cruelty wasn't the intention. But Melissa's eyes were steady, cold, daring him to argue. He turned to Daniel, desperate for a lifeline, for the boy he had raised to speak, to defend him, to remind Melissa who he was, what he had given. But Daniel didn't meet his eyes. He shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, and muttered, "Maybe it's best, for everyone's sake." The betrayal hit harder than the insult. Melissa's words were barbed, but expected. Her contempt had always been simmering beneath the surface. But Daniel's silence, his agreement, was a knife driven straight into Thomas's heart. The son he had worked for, bled for, prayed for, had just chosen to stand against him, not with him. The room seemed to shrink, the air closing in around him. He wanted to scream, to pound his fists on the table, to force them both to see the man sitting there wasn't a burden, but the reason they had the life they lived. Instead, he stood quietly, the chair scraping against the floor in a sound that seemed to echo louder than Melissa's words. He walked to his room, his steps slow, deliberate, as if each one carried the weight of a lifetime. Inside the small guest room, he pulled his suitcases from the closet. 2 suitcases. That was what his life had been reduced to. He packed without speaking, folding clothes with trembling hands, each piece a reminder of how little he had left. He didn't cry. Not yet. The tears waited like storm clouds on the horizon. But in that moment, he was dry, hollow, numb. When the bags were full, he zipped them shut and carried them to the front door. No one stopped him. Melissa didn't move. Daniel didn't rise. His son didn't even look at him. Thomas stepped outside, the cold night air hitting him like another betrayal, and set the suitcases down on the curb. The wind bit through his coat as he stood there, staring up at the dark windows of the house he had entered, believing it was still family, still safety. He waited for a sound, for the door to open, for Daniel to come out and take it back. But the door stayed shut. The house stayed silent, and Thomas knew he had been erased. He sat on the curb for an hour, the night pressing in on him, the street quiet except for the occasional car passing by. His phone was dead, his heart no better. For the first time since Eleanor's death, he felt truly alone, the last tether to his old life cut clean. This wasn't just rejection. This was obliteration. Eventually, he dragged the suitcases to a roadside motel, the kind where wallpaper peeled at the corners and vending machines swallowed your quarters without mercy. The room smelled of stale smoke and despair. He dropped his bags by the bed and sat down hard, the springs groaning beneath him. He stared at the ceiling until his eyes blurred. The tears finally came, not loud, but silent, the kind that racked his chest, while the world outside carried on, indifferent. He thought about the sacrifices, about the years spent bent over under the Texas sun, about every holiday meal Eleanor had prepared while he worked late, about the nights he came home bone-tired, but still found the energy to read Daniel a story before bed. He thought about the calloused hands that had built a house, paid for college, carried the weight of every bill, every worry. And now, those same hands had been pushed away as though they had never built anything at all. Days blurred after that. He tried reaching out to Daniel with small texts, simple words like, "I understand, I love you." But silence was the only reply. Each unanswered message carved the wound deeper. He tried to find work, any work, But no one wanted a grieving widower in his 60s with a resume full of years behind him and nothing ahead. Each rejection piled onto the shame until it was unbearable. At night, in that cheap motel bed, Thomas lay awake staring at the cracks in the ceiling, wondering if this was what his life had come to. Discarded, forgotten, erased. But one evening, as he dug through a box of keepsakes, searching for something to remind him of who he was, his hand brushed against something unexpected. A leather-bound book, worn and fragile, tucked away like a secret. His father's old diary. He opened it, and the words on those pages revealed truths he had never known. Secrets hidden for decades, a story buried deep that carried power in its ink. As he read, his hand shook, his heart racing not with despair, but with something new, something sharp, something alive. And for the first time since that night at the dinner table, Thomas felt the flicker of a different fire. He was no longer just the father cast aside. He was a man holding a secret that could change everything. And Melissa, Daniel, they had no idea what storm was about to break. Thomas carried the weight of 60 years in 2 worn suitcases, each step down the narrow hallway echoing like a funeral march. He didn't slam the door, didn't raise his voice, didn't give them the satisfaction of hearing him break. He just walked out, the silence of the house behind him colder than the December air that cut across his face the moment he stepped outside. He set the bags on the curb and stood there for a long moment, staring at the dark windows, waiting for something, anything. A flicker of movement, a door cracking open, Daniel's voice calling him back. But the house stayed quiet, still, indifferent. His son hadn't followed him. Melissa hadn't bothered to feign politeness. It was as if he had already ceased to exist. The night pressed in heavy, the street deserted except for the whisper of wind and the occasional rattle of leaves tumbling along the pavement. He felt it then. The crushing weight of being erased, of standing on the edge of the world with nowhere to go. For years he had been the one to carry others, the one to provide, to build, to protect. Now he was nothing but a man with 2 suitcases and no home. The loneliness didn't come in waves. It came in a single, suffocating flood that left him gasping for air. He sat down on the curb, the cold biting through his coat, his hands trembling as he tried to steady himself. His phone was dead, not that there was anyone he could call. Eleanor was gone. Daniel had turned his back. Friends from the old neighborhood had faded into memories, names he hadn't spoken in years. He stared at the empty street and felt the ache of invisibility. The sharp realization that no one in the world would notice if he disappeared right then and there. When the chill became unbearable, he dragged the suitcases down the block until the neon glow of a roadside motel flickered through the dark. The sign buzzed faintly, half its letters dead, the parking lot littered with potholes. Inside, the clerk barely looked up as Thomas slid crumpled bills across the counter. The room smelled of stale smoke and mildew, the wallpaper peeling in thin strips, the carpet stiff with stains. He dropped his bags by the bed and sat down hard, the springs groaning beneath him like they, too, had given up. He didn't cry right away. The tears came later, in the kind of silence that eats through a man's chest until there's nothing left to hold them back. They weren't loud sobs, but quiet, broken ones. The kind that shake the body in short, violent tremors, while the world outside remains indifferent. He pressed his hands against his face, ashamed, furious, hollow, all at once. This was what it felt like to be discarded, not just unwanted, but erased. Days blurred into nights. The vending machine down the hall became his only source of meals. When his stomach growled too loud to ignore, he stared at the cracked ceiling until dawn bled pale light across the room, then rolled onto his side and watched dust drift in the beams. He tried sending messages to Daniel when he found a charger in his suitcase. Short ones, simple ones. I love you. I understand. "I'm okay." None were answered. The silence was worse than anger, worse than rejection. Silence was final. Silence was death. He walked the streets some afternoons, searching for help-wanted signs. But the looks he received told him everything. Too old, too tired, too broken. Employers didn't need a man with calloused hands and a heart still raw from grief. He applied anyway. Grocery stores, gas stations, diners. Each rejection piled higher until the shame was unbearable. By evening, he always returned to the motel, back to the four walls that reminded him he had nowhere else to go. The worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold or the endless silence. The worst part was the memory of Eleanor, how she had always believed Daniel would be their legacy, their pride, the reason they endured the long years of sacrifice. She had died believing her son would care for his father. Thomas lay awake at night, wondering if she could see him now, if she would recognize the man huddled alone in a motel room with nothing to his name but 2 suitcases and a broken heart. One night, unable to sleep, he dug through a small box of keepsakes he had carried from the old house, searching for something to anchor him. Among faded photographs and yellowed letters, his hand brushed against a leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age. His father's diary. He hadn't looked at it in decades. He almost put it back, too weary to care, but something about the weight of it in his hands kept him from letting go. He opened it under the dim glow of the bedside lamp, the pages brittle, the ink faded but legible. At first it was mundane, notes about weather, work, ordinary life. Then he reached the entries that weren't ordinary at all, lines that spoke of secrets Thomas had never been told, of promises made in shadows, of a legacy hidden just out of sight. He read them once, then again, his heart racing faster each time. The words revealed a truth that reframed everything, a revelation that shifted him from a man abandoned into a man holding power. For the first time in months, Thomas felt something stir inside him that wasn't grief or shame. It was sharp, electric, alive. He closed the diary, his hands trembling, and stared at the cracked ceiling once more. This time, he wasn't wondering how he would survive another day. This time, he was wondering how Daniel and Melissa would survive once he decided to act on what he now knew. The motel room still smelled of despair. The sheets were still stiff, the silence still heavy, but Thomas no longer felt like a man erased. The world had handed him a weapon hidden in ink and paper, and the people who cast him out had no idea what storm was already building just beyond their door. The nights stretched longer in that roadside motel, the kind of nights that swallow a man whole. Thomas lay on the lumpy mattress, staring at the ceiling where cracks formed a map of places he would never go. The hum of the neon sign outside bled through the blinds, pulsing in broken rhythm like a reminder of everything fractured in his life. He listened to the pipes groan in the walls, the muffled shouts from passing truckers, the buzz of a vending machine that smelled faintly of rust and stale sugar. In the quiet between those sounds, the silence pressed hardest, the silence that belonged to his son. Days had passed, each one slower than the last, and not once had Daniel called. Not once had his phone lit up with a message. The emptiness gnawed at him like hunger, deeper and more vicious than any pang in his stomach. He tried to remember if there had been a moment, a single decision, where everything turned. Had he pushed too hard when Daniel was younger? Had he been too strict, too distant, too absorbed in work? Or had he done the opposite? Had he been too soft, too forgiving, too ready to clean up every mess Daniel made? The questions circled his mind, each one without answer, each one another weight pressing down on his chest. He told himself fathers weren't supposed to ask for thanks, weren't supposed to need validation. But what he had never prepared for was erasure. for the cruel indifference of being forgotten by the one person who was supposed to remember. The motel became a coffin of memories. He thought of Eleanor, the way she used to hum in the kitchen as she made coffee. The sound so small and ordinary, yet large enough to fill a life. He thought of Daniel as a boy, running through the yard with scraped knees, clutching the toy truck Thomas had saved for weeks to buy. He thought of birthdays, of graduations, of long nights spent working overtime to make sure his son had shoes that fit, books that were new, doors that were open. Each memory was a blade now, each one cutting into the hollowness that grew inside him. He whispered Eleanor's name into the dark, as though she might answer, as though she might pull him back from the brink. But the only reply was the low rumble of a semi-truck passing on the highway, indifferent, relentless. Sometimes he scrolled through his phone, rereading old messages just to see Daniel's name on the screen. The words were simple, mundane. Thanks, Dad. Talk later. Busy at work. But even those fragments felt like lifelines now. He sent new messages, careful not to sound desperate. I love you. I hope you're okay. Just wanted to check in. The screen stayed blank. No reply, no sign of acknowledgement. He told himself maybe Daniel was busy, maybe work had swallowed him, maybe Melissa had twisted things. But in the marrow of his bones, Thomas knew the truth. Silence was a choice. Each day began the same. He woke to the stale smell of cigarettes embedded in the curtains, washed his face in a sink that dripped endlessly, and stared at the man in the mirror. The man who stared back was older than he remembered, his shoulders bent, his eyes ringed with sleepless nights, his skin pale from the absence of sunlight. He looked like a man no one would hire, a man who belonged nowhere. He applied anyway. Grocery stores, diners, warehouses. Each rejection was delivered with polite words, but he heard the truth underneath. Too old, too broken, too much trouble. He carried those rejections back to the motel like new weights to add to his chest. He ate when he could, cheap sandwiches from the gas station across the street, candy bars from the vending machine when the hunger became too sharp. He drank water from plastic cups that smelled faintly of bleach. He watched people in the parking lot, families loading into minivans, couples arguing, travelers dragging coolers toward their rooms. They all had somewhere to be, someone waiting for them. Thomas had nothing but 2 suitcases and the echo of silence on his phone. At night, the loneliness grew so loud it was unbearable. He would close his eyes and see Daniel's face at the dinner table, hear Melissa's voice calling him an extra mouth, feel the way his son looked away. He would remember the way Eleanor's hand used to rest on his, grounding him, steadying him, reminding him he wasn't alone. Without her, without Daniel, he was drifting. He wondered if this was what people meant when they said life could hollow you out, when they said despair was a quiet thing. It wasn't a scream. It was the sound of nothing, stretched over days that refused to end. One evening, as he sat on the edge of the bed, with the lamp casting a weak yellow glow, he opened the old box of keepsakes he had carried from Cedar Ridge. Inside were photographs curled at the edges, Eleanor's handwriting on birthday cards, fragments of a life that once had meaning. His fingers brushed against a leather-bound book he hadn't thought of in years. His father's diary. He pulled it out slowly, the cover cracked, the pages brittle with age. He flipped it open, expecting more of the same silence, ordinary notes about weather and work. Instead, he found something else. Words that weren't meant for him to see. Words that carried secrets long buried. Truths that shifted the ground beneath his feet. He read slowly at first, then faster, his hands trembling as he turned the pages. Each line revealed pieces of a story he had never known. Promises made in shadows, arrangements hidden from the world. By the time he closed the book, his heart was pounding, his chest alive with something he hadn't felt in months. It wasn't despair anymore. It was something sharper. A fire, small but burning, flickering against the darkness. The silence of the motel room still pressed in. The sheets still smelled of bleach. The vending machine still hummed like a broken lullaby. But Thomas was no longer just a man abandoned. He was a man with a secret, a man holding knowledge that had power. For the first time since he had stood on that curb with his suitcases, he didn't feel erased. He felt dangerous. And Daniel and Melissa had no idea that the silence they had given him was about to be shattered. Thomas kept the phone on the nightstand as if its black screen were a lifeline, as if at any moment it might light up and tell him he was wrong, that his son hadn't truly abandoned him. In the mornings, when the sun slanted through the cheap curtains of the motel and painted everything in pale yellow, he would sit on the edge of the bed and type out short messages. Nothing long, nothing that might sound like pleading, just simple words a father might send his son. "How are you? I hope work isn't too hard. Just checking in." And sometimes, when the weight of silence was too much, he wrote the only 3 words he knew Daniel could not mistake. "I love you." He pressed send, watched the little bubble disappear, and waited. The wait was the hardest part. He told himself an answer would come, that Daniel was just busy, that Melissa's bitterness had twisted things, and his son didn't know how to push back. He refreshed the screen until the battery drained. When no reply came, he plugged the phone back in, sat on the bed with his elbows on his knees, and stared at the floor. The motel room buzzed with silence, heavier than the traffic outside, or the thump of footsteps in the hall. Each unanswered message wasn't just a blank. It was a blade, carving deeper into the hollow space where a father's hope lived. At night, the quiet grew unbearable. He thought of Eleanor, of how she would never have allowed their son to slip so far away. She would have stormed into Daniel's life, demanded he look at his father and remember. But she was gone, and Thomas carried that weight alone. He lay awake, the ceiling cracks above him stretching into shapes that reminded him of paths he had never taken. He replayed moments with Daniel, the times he'd sat on the porch swing teaching him to throw a baseball, the nights he worked overtime to buy him new school shoes, the proud smile he wore when Daniel walked across the stage at graduation. Every memory came with the same sting. He had given and given and given, and now he was left with silence. Still, he kept trying. He couldn't stop. Hope was a cruel addiction, but it was all he had left. One morning, with his coffee gone cold in his hand, he typed another message. "Just wanted you to know I'm proud of you." He stared at it for a long time, thumb hovering, then hit send. Again, nothing. The screen stayed blank, empty, mute. He told himself maybe Daniel read them and didn't know what to say. Maybe Melissa saw them first and erased them. Maybe his son was ashamed. Too ashamed to face him after that night at the dinner table. The maybes circled like vultures, each one tearing at him, each one leaving him weaker. The motel clerk began to recognize him, nodding when Thomas shuffled past to buy another coffee or ask for more soap. Thomas saw the way the man's eyes flickered, pity mixed with disinterest. He had become part of the background, another forgotten traveler in a place designed for people passing through. But he wasn't passing through. He was stuck, suspended in the kind of limbo where days bled into nights, and the only thing that changed was the number of unanswered messages on his phone. Sometimes he sat by the window, staring out at the parking lot. He watched families load up their cars, listened to children laugh as they chased each other between the cracked lines of faded asphalt. He thought about how once, not so long ago, Daniel had been that child, and he had been the father guiding him into the car, carrying the luggage, making sure the doors were locked. He wondered if any of those children would grow up to turn their backs. If any of those fathers would one day sit alone in a motel room clinging to scraps of hope that refused to die. The silence from Daniel became its own language. Every unanswered word was a sentence, every blank screen a declaration. I don't need you. I don't see you. You are nothing to me. Thomas tried not to hear it, tried to pretend the silence meant nothing. But it spoke louder than anything Melissa had ever said, louder than the mutters in the hall, louder than the contempt in her eyes. One evening, as the light outside dimmed and the neon sign sputtered into life, Thomas sat on the bed with the phone in his hand. He opened the thread of messages, scrolling through every one he had sent. There they were, lined up like prayers tossed into the void. Some were practical. Hope you're eating well. Others were soft. Thinking of you. Most were short, almost hesitant, as though he feared being too heavy, too demanding. And then the ones that mattered most. I love you. He read them again and again, as though the words might echo back to him if he stared long enough. But the silence never broke. The phone never lit up. And slowly, painfully, he began to realize what the truth was. It wasn't that Daniel didn't know what to say. It wasn't that Melissa intercepted the messages. It was that his son had chosen not to answer. That realization cracked something inside him, something that had been fragile but still holding on. He set the phone down on the nightstand and pressed his hands against his face. The quiet grief that rolled through him wasn't loud, wasn't violent. It was deep, steady, relentless, like a tide pulling him further from the shore. Yet even as despair seeped in, another feeling stirred beneath it, faint but undeniable. A spark. Because buried in his suitcase, folded at the bottom of the box of keepsakes, was the leather-bound diary he had found. And inside it were words that changed everything. Words that reminded him he wasn't just a man waiting for his son to acknowledge him. He was someone who carried a truth no one else knew. A truth that could upend everything Daniel and Melissa thought they controlled. As Thomas lay back on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling with the neon glow flickering through the blinds, he knew the silence could not last forever. His unanswered words had carved wounds, yes, but they had also given him time, space to see what was coming. And what was coming would not be another message left unread. It would be something sharp, something final. Something that would make his son and daughter-in-law realize they had never truly erased him. They had only lit the fuse. The night the secret revealed itself began, like all the others. Thomas sitting alone in the dim motel room, the lamp casting a sickly yellow glow across peeling wallpaper, the hum of the vending machine outside his door droning like a reminder of how far he had fallen. He had been sorting through the old box of keepsakes he had carried from Cedar Ridge. Not because he expected comfort, but because he needed proof that once he had lived a life that mattered. Photographs curled at the edges, Eleanor's notes in her familiar looping script, faded birthday cards Daniel had made with crayons when he was small. Each piece carried the sting of memory, each one a weight pressing against his ribs. But then, beneath it all, his fingers brushed against something heavier, a leather-bound book cracked with age, its cover scarred with time. His father's diary. Thomas hadn't opened it in decades. For years it had been tucked away. A relic of a man he had respected but never truly understood. A man who had worked the land with stern hands and few words. Now, in this moment of exile, it felt like an anchor. He opened it slowly, the pages brittle beneath his calloused fingers. At first, it was ordinary. Notes about the weather, about cattle prices, about small-town events. But as the pages turned, the words shifted. The tone grew secretive, guarded. Thomas leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he read about meetings conducted in whispers, names written only in initials, promises recorded as though the pages themselves were conspirators. He read once, then again, the words blurring before sharpening with clarity. His father had carried a secret, one that had lived in the shadows of their family for decades. The entries spoke of connections Thomas never imagined, ties to a man of wealth and influence, arrangements made in private that hinted at power waiting to be claimed. His father had not been just a farmer scratching out survival in the dust. He had been more than that, tied to something larger, something hidden. Thomas's hands trembled as he traced the ink, as though by touching the words he might bridge the years between the man he thought he knew and the truth now staring back at him. At first, the shock hollowed him out. He sat frozen on the edge of the bed, the diary open across his lap. The hum of the vending machine suddenly deafening. His whole life he had believed in simplicity, in duty, in sacrifice. And now, here was evidence that beneath the surface of his family's story, there had been another current running strong, a current that had been kept from him, perhaps to protect him, perhaps to control him. He thought of Eleanor and wondered if she had ever known, if she had carried this truth quietly beside him all those years. He thought of Daniel sitting in his townhouse, blind and arrogant, treating his father as though he were nothing. Daniel had no idea. Then the shock began to shift. It no longer felt like emptiness, but like a surge, a current running through him that was sharper than grief, more electric than despair. He turned the pages faster, reading about trust funds hidden outside the estate, about a lawyer named Goldstein who had been entrusted with letters and accounts, about instructions to be carried out in secret. His father had prepared for something, had left a legacy buried deep, and now Thomas was the only one standing at the edge of that discovery. For months he had been erased, discarded, abandoned. But now, holding this diary, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: power. He closed the book and sat still. The silence around him transformed. The motel no longer felt like a coffin, but like a waiting room, a place where a man sharpened himself before stepping back into the world. He looked at the cracked ceiling again, but this time it didn't mock him. This time he felt as though the cracks were maps, roads leading somewhere new, somewhere dangerous. He thought of Daniel's silence, of Melissa's smirk across the dinner table, of the way they had erased him with a single sentence. "We can't keep feeding an extra mouth." They believed they had buried him. What they didn't know was that the man they had cast out was now holding a weapon forged in the secrets of another generation. The empowerment came not with loud promises or reckless thoughts, but with a quiet steadiness. He wasn't broken anymore. He wasn't begging for replies from his son or waiting for scraps of kindness. He was a man with knowledge that could upend everything. He whispered aloud, testing the strength of his own voice in the stale motel air. "You don't know me at all." The sound carried, small but unshakable. That night Thomas didn't cry. He didn't tremble with despair. He sat at the desk with the diary open in front of him, copying down names, dates, clues that led forward like stepping stones into the unknown. Each word he wrote was a reminder that his story wasn't finished, that the silence he had endured was about to be shattered. The phone on the nightstand remained dark, Daniel still absent, Melissa still contemptuous. But for the first time in months, Thomas no longer cared. Their silence no longer defined him. What he held in his hands did. He imagined Daniel's face, if he knew. He imagined Melissa's expression when the man she had sneered at revealed what he truly carried. The thought didn't fill him with petty satisfaction. It filled him with clarity. They had erased him because they thought he was powerless. Now he understood that power wasn't loud. It wasn't about the seat at the dinner table or the roof over his head. Power was quiet. Power was knowing the truth when others were blind. Power was holding secrets that could not be erased. As the hours stretched into dawn, Thomas sat by the window, watching the sky shift from black to gray to the faintest pale blue. The world outside was waking up, trucks starting in the parking lot, voices rising in the hallway. But inside the room, something entirely different had woken. The man who had been discarded, who had sat alone on the curb with 2 suitcases and no one to call, no longer existed. In his place was someone new, someone sharpened by loss, someone steadied by truth. He closed the diary, placed it gently on the nightstand, and leaned back in the chair, exhaustion pulling at him but unable to dim the fire now burning inside. He didn't know yet how he would use what he had found. He didn't know what the next step would be. But he knew this. Daniel and Melissa's world was built on the belief that he was nothing, and soon they would discover how wrong they had been. For the first time in months, Thomas felt his lips curve into something he hadn't known he was still capable of. A smile, not warm or wistful, but sharp, the kind a man wears when the ground shifts in his favor. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was the quiet recognition that he wasn't the discarded father sitting in a roadside motel with 2 suitcases anymore. He was a man who held something real, something that could not be taken from him. In his hands was the diary, and within its pages were truths no one else had. Truths that gave him back the one thing Melissa and Daniel had stripped away: control. The same silence that had nearly destroyed him was now his shield. They had no idea what was coming. The room around him hadn't changed. The flicker of the neon sign still cut through the blinds. The smell of mildew and cigarette smoke still clung to the walls. The hum of the vending machine still droned like an endless reminder of his exile. But the man inside that room had changed. He leaned forward in the chair, elbows braced on the desk, eyes burning with a light that had been absent for too long. His reflection in the streaked window was different now. No longer a man erased, but a man waiting, calculating, sharpening. He thought of Melissa, her eyes rolling with contempt, as though he were something foul in the air. He thought of Daniel, looking away at the table when he had needed him most. He had replayed that moment countless times, the sound of the chair scraping back, the words that cut him down to an extra mouth. Every time, the wound reopened. But now, thinking of it again, he felt something else. Clarity. Their betrayal had freed him from illusion. He didn't have to beg for their acceptance anymore. He didn't need it. He had truth, and truth was heavier than their disdain. He opened the diary again, fingers tracing the words as though memorizing them by touch. Names, dates, arrangements hidden behind initials and codes. His father had not been a simple man scratching out survival in dust and sweat. He had been connected, careful, deliberate, building a legacy that had slipped quietly into Thomas's hands. The thought of it made his chest tighten, not with fear, but with vindication. Daniel thought his father had nothing left to give, nothing left to claim. Melissa thought she had silenced him with contempt. They were both wrong. The smile deepened, a flicker of strength spreading through him like fire catching dry grass. He began to plan in the silence, the way builders plan before laying foundations. Each piece of information in the diary was a brick. Each memory of humiliation was mortar. He could see the structure forming, not yet complete, but inevitable. He imagined Daniel's face when he realized his father hadn't been erased, but had returned with something sharper than forgiveness. He imagined Melissa's smirk dissolving when she saw that the man she had dismissed as useless carried the weight of something they couldn't ignore. Sleep eluded him that night, but it wasn't the restless tossing of despair. It was the alert, electric wakefulness of a man who knew he had work to do. He sat by the window until dawn, watching the world shift from black to gray to pale gold, every minute feeding the determination growing inside him. The motel, once a prison, now felt like a staging ground. He wasn't trapped. He was preparing. When morning came, he walked outside with a steadier stride, the cold air filling his lungs, not with loneliness, but with purpose. The traffic rumbled past, families loaded their cars, strangers moved with hurried steps. But Thomas walked slowly, deliberately, as though he carried something no one else could see. Because he did. Hidden in his coat was the diary, the relic that had become a weapon, and within him was a resolve sharper than any blade. He still sent messages to Daniel, not because he expected replies, but because each one was a seed. Simple words, the kind a father might write, but behind them was the knowledge that he was no longer pleading. He was waiting. He was watching. Each unanswered text didn't wound him anymore. It fueled him. Silence wasn't rejection now. It was proof of their blindness, proof that they had no idea he was no longer the man they thought they had discarded. By evening, back in the motel room, Thomas sat with a notebook open beside the diary, writing down plans in his neat, careful hand. He made lists of names, traced the paths his father had recorded, followed clues like a man mapping a hidden trail. Each line brought him closer to something larger, something that would shift the balance of power entirely. He wasn't reckless. He didn't need to be. Recklessness was for the desperate. He was no longer desperate. He was certain. The days that followed no longer dragged. They sharpened. Each morning was a chance to dig deeper into the secrets he now carried. Each night was a step closer to the moment Daniel and Melissa would learn the truth. He thought of them often, but no longer with sorrow. Now he thought of them the way a hunter thinks of prey, not with rage, but with focus. They had written him off, erased him from their story, but soon their story would bend around his. And in the quietest moments, when the diary lay closed on the desk and the lamp flickered against the motel's peeling walls, Thomas allowed himself to picture Eleanor. He imagined her looking at him with the steady eyes she had always carried, the eyes that told him to hold firm even when the world tried to grind him down. He wondered if she would smile, seeing him not broken but rising. He whispered her name into the dark, not as a plea this time, but as a promise. Thomas no longer feared the silence. He no longer feared the empty nights or the absence of his son's voice. He had stepped past despair, past humiliation, past grief. Now he carried only resolve, the quiet determination of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to reveal. His fingers rested on the diary, steady and strong. What Daniel and Melissa believed was over had only just begun. And when the truth finally came to light, it wouldn't be loud. It would be steady, precise, undeniable. They would see him not as the forgotten father cast aside with 2 suitcases, but as the man who had returned with the kind of power no silence could ever erase. And they would learn too late that erasing him had been their greatest mistake. Life has a way of testing us in the cruelest moments, when loss has already hollowed us out, and when the people we trusted most turn away. Thomas's story is painful, but it carries lessons that speak to anyone who has ever felt invisible. It reminds us that dignity doesn't vanish just because others fail to see it. Our worth is not measured by how children, spouses, or society choose to treat us, but by the truth we hold within ourselves and the strength we choose to stand on. Even when the world tries to erase us, there can still be hidden reserves of resilience waiting to be uncovered. For older generations, this story shows the importance of not surrendering to despair, of remembering that wisdom, experience, and quiet perseverance are powerful tools. It's never too late to reclaim control of your life, to find purpose, and to remind others, sometimes painfully, that you are not to be dismissed. Life after betrayal is still life worth living, and the ability to rise from abandonment is a victory no one can take away. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice, your lessons, and your strength matter.